Hi, welcome back again. We're plodding through semester one together and hopefully these videos are helping you out. So the past couple of weeks I've done a couple of videos to help people out who are doing dissertations and I don't want the first and second years to feel really shortchanged. If you are in third year or even if you're starting out in your masters, this might be a great refresher for you anyway, because today I want to tackle how to evaluate sources effectively. It's so easy, even as you move through your degree, for these things to kind of go out the window because you're trying to second guess what the marker wants all the time. But there are some bread and butter basics to evaluating historical sources that will always be really helpful for you and might be helpful for you to think about if you are starting out in classics or ancient history, perhaps not with an A-level in that subject. Maybe you've had A-level in history and English literature and things like that. And you're thinking, well, this is evidence I've never tackled before. This video should help you out. So today we're going to look at a lot of different ancient sources. Some are from material culture and some are from literature, and we can think about how to push on with source evaluation so that when you're writing essays you can tick the 2-1 and first class grade criteria and you can evaluate sources with a good understanding of what they mean and what they tell us about the past. Okay. So the number one thing to recap, and if you've been watching my videos so far, you'll already know this, is what is a primary source. So quite often, very sloppily, we say secondary sources, and really they're not sources. Secondary material is opinion, it's things that modern scholars write about the ancient world, and sources are from the ancient world, okay? So primary sources would be such as Greek vases, an ancient text, some coins, ancient armour, something from the time period itself. It can get a bit hazy if you're dealing with an ancient source who's writing a couple of hundred years later, but that's something to worry about later on. It's the difference between near contemporary evidence and opinion that I've covered in previous videos. So the main thing to think about when you're looking at sources is asking the right questions. That is what it's all about. It's not always about having the correct answers. If you ask the right questions, you'll find gaps in our understanding of the different sources that we have. And when you're doing ancient history and classics, there are plenty of those. And it's as much about understanding what we can't know as knowing what we can. So let's have a look at some examples together. So for a first example, we've got a nice suit of armour, okay? And the questions that you should be asking with this are, what date is it from? When can we date it to? The most basic question, but when I did seminars on sources like this in the past, everyone blanked and forgot. So hopefully if you're a historian, that'll be really comfy for you. When can we date this to and why? On what basis can we date it to that period or that time? What's the purpose of it? And again, there are other questions that might help us fill this out. So a really simple one for artifacts is actually, what size is it? We have no idea by looking at 2D pictures if this is a suit of armour that someone could have feasibly worn, or if this is like a tiny replica that someone would use as an ornament. So you need the scale. It's amazing how if you're looking in a source book, your brain just fills the gaps. Now this is something that would have been worn, this is human size, but don't assume anything like that. Always worth checking it out. And for things such as coins, you should get a little measure coming underneath the picture that shows you the size of it. And we'll come to that a little bit more later on. So where is it from? What's its purpose? How big is it? What material is it made from? Where was it made? Okay, so for anything that you can wear, you might be thinking of it being made in a particular region that specialised in it. And then you want to compare, where was it found? So if you're an archaeologist, you're thinking, way ahead. That's something that came to mind straight away. So where do we think it was made? Where do we think it was found? And on what basis are we making these judgments? So it might be, for example, that you're looking at a material that's really known for a specific region. It might be that you're looking at particular iconography or artwork that's on here. Now, unfortunately, the armour just shows texture. The only thing we can see is this kind of crest at the top, which might give us an indication of where it was from, but we're not getting any kind of mythology that roots it to a particular region. But there are really key questions you could ask about this armour. Who was wearing it? Is it a precious material that demonstrates a particular status within the army? And then you can get more and more focused. What does it tell us about warfare in the period? So what didn't we find with the armour is a really good question. We can see a breastplate, we can see a helmet, but we can't see greaves for the arms or for the shins, and we can't see anything that will protect the top of the legs. So what's missing and why? how could we compare this with something else to give us a picture of how this would have been used in action. So I've peppered lots of questions there, and that's really what source evaluation is about. And you can answer some and not others, and spot gaps in our knowledge. And it's asking the right questions and answering as many of them as possible, and acknowledging what you can't answer, which can be really frustrating when you shift from modern history to ancient history, but it's sometimes where you can make the most interesting inferences. Okay, so we've had a look at some armour. Let's take a look at a coin. So again, you might be thinking, what's the denomination of the coin? That's really intuitive when you're thinking about something monetary. What region is it from? So again, is there any iconography or anything to do with the material that we think this is made from that suggests it was made and struck in a particular region? How does it differ from things like armour? Well, a coin is incredibly portable property, so the difference between where you think it was made and where it was actually found can have implications on, say, where you'd plot a trade route in the ancient world, and what would you be expecting to be in that trade route? Who's trading what for this money? So we can see some of the kind of mobility of different peoples and traders by looking at the positioning of coins. We can also see some of the regional iconography that comes up. So you can have a little look at Pegasus, and hopefully you've all recognised him from the front. And on the reverse we have a copper, K-O-P-P-A, so it looks like, almost like, unfortunately, a swastika symbol. But in the Greek world, this is a sign of good luck. Okay, so it can help you really look up different things like trade routes, materials, iconography, but also, you know, where is it positioned versus how much is it actually worth? Is this something we'd be expecting an everyday person to carry? Is it indicative of a wealthy person, and does that tie in with where it was found? Was it found in, you know, the ruins of a very affluent person's home or such as that? Okay, again, a really key distinction is thinking about portable property, so things that could have been moved from where they were made, manufactured, to where they ended up, and it tells us about the kind of mobility going on in the ancient world. Great. So we've had a look at a couple of artifacts, and another one to think about with coins before we move on is, can you see both sides when you're looking in a source book or a textbook? Sometimes, not always, but you'll just get the pretty side, so you'll just get the Pegasus side, for example. So you don't always get what we call the obverse, the front and the reverse. So make sure you can see both sides and you can see all the way around. Let's have a look at something a bit more complicated. So if you're looking at a particular site, and again, archaeologists will be really, really comfortable with this. If you are a classical civilization student and you're balancing modules that are sometimes literature and sometimes history with a lot of material culture, this might not be that intuitive. But if we look at a site like this, it's geographically rooted, so we can be comfy with where it was built because it's there, can't move that far. You might be thinking, what's its function? What material is it made out of? Who built it? So in this instance, we have a nice theatre, you can see, because it sweeps around. And again, thinking about what adaptations might have been added to it. So, you know, think of the equivalent of an ancient conservatory being slapped on. Did this theatre change in the Roman period when skene buildings at the front were made more elaborate and you had a big skene fronds on the theatre? So what could have changed? Another really helpful thing to look out for a site is, what's the excavation date? So sometimes if sites were excavated quite early on, the techniques in archaeology perhaps weren't as good, things might have been compromised, things might have been looted, and if you're an Egyptologist you'll be nodding your head right now because lots of things from Egyptian tombs were looted. So what's been the lifespan of this site after it was originally built? Okay, and they're the sorts of considerations you would have for a building. Okay, if you ask them, figure them out, you might be thinking more about how people lived or worked in that particular region, but also how that region changed over time, how tastes changed, things that are really rooted to a particular geographical area, of course, because you're not dealing with portable property. Okay, so we've had a look at some source material where, if you're an ancient historian or an archaeologist, you may be quite happy. If you're a classicist who prefers literature, you might be a bit stressed out by those. let's move on and take a look at textual sources, okay? So we've got some of the usual suspects if we're thinking about Roman history. And I've given the example of, say, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and our friend Plutarch. The intuitive thing to do when you're thinking about source evaluation is thinking about everyone individually, okay? So your starting point would be, what class are they? In the ancient world, we can usually assume that they're fairly affluent if they're able to read and write. What political roles might they have? Again, because they're affluent people, they might have a particular political agenda or job. If you were educated to that level, you would possibly be quite politically involved. You might be thinking about who they were writing under, who was the ruler at the time, and whether they were pro or anti that person, whether they had a conflicting relationship. And you might, if you're really thinking about it, be comparing the particular passage, so the date that the events allegedly took place, to the time that the author is actually writing. So when was Caesar assassinated versus when was Suetonius writing about Caesar's assassination? If you were quite well read in that person, if you've done A-levels in, say, Class Civ or Latin, and you've read this historian quite a bit, you have a bit of a feel for them, you might have an idea of who exaggerates more and can think of instances where they're perhaps not that reliable. So when you're looking within a text itself, you can look for things like really specific figures or dialogue from different historical characters, and in these texts they are characters, and say, okay, maybe this historian isn't as authoritative as they're letting on because they weren't there at the time and they can't know that this person said that. So figures and dialogue are really important to look out for. Also, think of them as literary texts. So if you're an English literature Class Civ person, you can put your literature hat on and think, oh, this person's being characterised in a particular way. I can see these sorts of adjectives come up a lot, or the historian's telling me how they feel, which they couldn't possibly know. And there are some things to watch out for to help you evaluate whether you're going to trust this source or not, or how far you can really trust this source. One thing that I want to flag when we're talking about textual sources too is, at this level, saying that a source is biased, and it's biased, or it has a bias, biased noun, biased adjective, is not helpful. Every source is biased. You can take it for granted that each source has a bias. Everyone's got a particular perspective or opinion. So to just say that, oh, well, such and such has their own opinion, or this text is biased, isn't helpful. It's a throwaway statement that doesn't really show the marker that you understand the issues with the text. So rather than saying this is biased, you could say, this paints this person in a poor light, perhaps because, and give a for instance why this might be the case. So again, look back at those political relationships or such as that. Be specific with what you think is affecting the text, and don't just say it's biased. There's bias in everything. And I know that it's a bit of a hangover from A-level, so I understand, I get why you do it, but it's time to think about being more specific now. So once you've looked at the text individually, a really lovely thing to do if you're perhaps someone who's working at 2221 and you want to really push your 2-1 up, or you want to get into that first class category, is think about comparing primary sources. So this is a much higher level way of addressing the primary material, and an assured and confident use of primary sources is one of the grade criteria for first class marking. Oh, I've done too much marking that I can remember that. So a really lovely way to do this, and you can do this in your seminar preparation, you can do this in your lecture notes, you can do this in your revision, is putting these different historical sources on a timeline themselves. So get a timeline for when each author wrote about the same event. If you have an essay question on the same event, or you're trying to understand a particular event, this is a really good way of focusing your source evaluation. So I'll put a for instance up on the screen for you to have a look at. So each of these sources gives an account of the assassination of Caesar, and you can find overlap in some of the sources. Now, when you start to compare and you find a common thread in the sources, you might take that as a sign of reliability and say, hey, brilliant, all of them are saying that Caesar died in this particular place, so so it is written, so it must be. But a nice thing to do by putting them in a bit of a timeline is to think about actually which historian is using which previous historian as a source. So you can think of this as a huge game of Chinese whispers that would start with Plutarch and then go to Suetonius, go to Dio. So it filters through each person. What that also allows you to do is pick up discrepancies. So extra bit in, has Suetonius, being Suetonius, rewritten it to make it more salacious and exciting? And that is kind of the throwaway statement that we make about Suetonius. So Suetonius is, in my view, the gossip girl of the ancient world. It gives you an idea of why each author's writing. So we think of them all as historians, but in the context of their work, they have their own agenda. So Suetonius is writing the lives of the Caesars, and he wants to characterise them all in a really different way. He's not giving a dispassionate list of their, life events. He wants to make it exciting and very readable because he's having these key figures put side by side. And he's writing with this kind of cult of personality potentially because he's focusing on those key people, not on events in the same way that, say, Thucydides wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. He's not fronting the big personalities in that conflict in the way that Suetonius is saying, hey, look at the Caesars. Okay? And you can see who's copied who's differed from who, and you can think about why. You can also think about historical distancing more accurately. So, do we trust Plutarch more than we trust Dio? Because Plutarch's sources are earlier and closer to the events. Okay, hopefully that's given you a really good introduction to source evaluation, and I'd love to see you guys putting some of this into practice. So if you've come up with a good way of evaluating sources, if you've got a nice little form or a way you like to make your notes, take a snapshot and put it in the comments below. Until then, don't forget to like, subscribe and share if you think any of this might be helpful for your friends. So good luck with your preparation for seminars, and I'll see you next time.